Hi and welcome to this webinar. My name is Jan Ariel, and in my day job I go to our customers and potential customers and I try to help them to tackle digital transformation. So today we're going to be talking about how you can combine the effect of agile security and innovation in order to tackle your digital transformation. And this is the agenda. So we're going to be talking about a bit of the traditional polarization of innovation and security. We're going to see how we can combine innovation and transformation with agile security. Then we're going to be talking a bit about, how IT is actually becoming pretty critical to not only businesses but even to our own existence as humans. We're going to end this webinar with some takeaways that hopefully will give some value in your organization. Traditionally, both innovation people and security people are seen as a support function to the organization. And they do tend to polarize with the rest. If you're an innovative person, you always tend to get the message that, what you're doing seems really cool. It's just that we're not there yet, and you're really breaking our existing processes. And when you work with security, you sort of always tend to feel overwhelmed, not only by the fact that you have to protect the company and its users from third-party threats, but you also see that a lot of people working inside the organization constantly seem to neglect the fact that you put some basic security in place. So both of these are quite frustrating roles at times, and when you put them in the same room, it can be even more frustrating because they're pretty much on very different planets. A bit of the key challenge today when you're doing a transformation is to really find the right balance. And on one part, you could be wanting to roll out minimal viable products, which is that sometimes you should have some basic security measures in place, or it should not only be a proof of concept, it should actually be a minimal viable product. And you can't really roll that out to the market. Maybe you shouldn't roll it out to the market unless you have done some basic security work on this product. And on the other side, you could be doing too much. You could be implementing all the security processes that you have in your company even before you have rolled out your product. So you would end up with a product that is not necessarily very agile or very lean, and maybe is even too secure for its market segment. I borrowed some numbers from one of the latest Checkpoint surveys, and it states that almost 60% of executives think that controlling security risks has become way more complex in the past 2 years. And part of the reason for that is obviously the digital transformation that everyone is going through, where they're trying to combine all their traditional investment in the private clouds and traditional infrastructure with building new applications and services using hyperscalers, public clouds, SaaS services, PaaS services, and so on. And as you can see here on this survey, they're also stating that it has become way more complex to actually manage all these environments. And eventually they blame it on the users. They say that more than 40%, states that this is due to the increased number of users in the organization. And it could be that this increase of users is actually hired consultants that they use as part of the competencies to tackle that transformation. And the key learning here is really that if you do not have the basic measures and foundation in place to handle a hybrid multi-cloud environment where you can actually accelerate, you're going to have to tackle all this complexity, also maybe using a lot of manual processes, and it's quite inefficient. A really key challenge for most companies today is actually to be able to fit their security processes to their development processes. And the reason why this is challenging is that IT has gone from focusing on technology and processes, and now it's actually focusing on the business model itself. So how do you build this business model and you need to become a digital leader in order to support that business model to actually transform the company you're working for. So as part of this, a security approach is fundamentally different from what it was before. The good thing is that the traditional security competence, it's still valid, just that it's just 10 to 20% of all the competences you need in order to secure your new style of business model. So one example is that you will need to adapt data scientists into your security team. You need to be able to handle codified application infrastructure using infrastructure as code, which means that you're going to have to pick security services as part of your DevOps toolkit in order to incorporate that as part of your DevOps culture. And then you have all of the big data area rolling in, where we're not even talking about applications, we're just looking at data and how we can access that data and move that data from data to information to insight and wisdom in order to support the new business model. And quite contrary from before, now in order to be able to tap in on all these ecosystems where all the competencies sits, because you don't have everything inside your own company, you need to be way more transparent before, which also puts pressure on your security models and the way you're working with security, because before you have been trying to avoid transparency because it made sense. And then you have the whole wave of how to govern and govern social media. And fact is that if the wrong information comes out on your company, and even if it's false, it can actually make your stock drops, and that has really nothing to do with your firewall. It's just it's a different type of threat that can basically undermine the revenue of your company. So the key point here really is that security, it's more relevant than it has ever been, because the threat picture is very, very different, and it's not only about firewalls and the traditional security mechanisms anymore. And just to give an example on how the effect of digital transformation is affecting our everyday life, there has been a lot of accidents with self-driving Teslas lately, and here you see the Google self-driving car, which gets into an accident and actually injures people. And the key point here is really that this is just the beginning. Technology and services basing on technology is really becoming part of our everyday life. And it's not only banking anymore, or being able to log into your banking account. It's actually part of your life, which can mean life or death for a lot of us. And it's just going to be more and more integrated in the years to come. And here's another example, this time a corporate example, where FedEx leaked a lot of different sensitive data because of a vulnerability in the software using AWS S3 buckets. And we talk a lot about security by design. In fact, it's like, all these services that you buy from these hyperscalers, they are pretty much secure by design. And what's interesting here is that it's not that specific component that was the problem. It was actually the way it was implemented. It was actually it was actually on the application layer. And there's a lot of confusion in the market, a lot about this still, because when you buy a SaaS service, when you buy a PaaS service, when you buy an IaaS service in the market, what's really your responsibility? Do you just do development? Do you only do functional development? Or do you also need to work with security as part of that development process? And the key point here is really like, unless you incorporate security measures, security competencies as part of your innovation process, things like this will happen over and over and over again. And here is another example, another corporate example, where companies like Dropbox and LinkedIn lost a lot of passwords, more than 70 million, and they're now, all over the internet to be used for various purposes by hackers or script kiddies or whatever want to play around with these passwords. So again, point being, this is happening over and over and over again, and the main reason is to the fact that we're implementing technology in the wrong way. So let's take a look at some predictions from our friends, the analysts. So base this numbers on reports from companies like Gartner, Forrester, IDC, IDG, and 451 Research, and so on. And what they're telling us is that by 2021, 10 providers, they're going to account for nearly 70% of the market when you look at infrastructure as service. And because of that, we're going to see the number of security incidents and security problems actually go down comparing to those in traditional data centers. The reason for that is, of course, we were standardizing, and a lot more of the security, it will be, it will be becoming more standard. So fewer vendors, more standardization, a higher level of security, which is what you're seeing, for instance, with working with a hyperscaler. The key components that they are making, they are pretty much secure by design, and they're much more secure than if you were to dream up a machine learning PaaS service by yourself, working with that 6 months and spending 5 developers on it. However, companies, customers, organizations, they're not going to throw away their past investments. So what's going to happen is that they're going to start innovating, and all this innovation that is based on more standardized components, using them like hyperscalers and multi-cloud and all that all those things. They're going to be integrated with what you'll be doing in your current data center, and it can be on the data level, it can be on the application level, it can be during APIs, it can be on many different things. And the fact is, like, by 2022, they're predicting that at least 95% of the security failures, it will still be the customer's fault. So what does that tell us? It tells us that even though they're coming more and more standardization to the market, a lot of that thanks to the hyperscalers, and the components are secure by design, we are going to build this in a way, the customer is going to build this in a way that is fundamentally insecure. So we're not going to be seeing less security incidents. We're going to most likely have more, because we're building 10 times faster now than we did 5 to 10 years ago, which gets me to the point that, starting thinking about security as part of your development process, it really makes sense when you build your applications, and you should be working with partners and ecosystems that allows you to do that, because we rarely see that companies have these competencies inside their own organization. So we're still going to have a lot to do when it comes to security in the future. Just because the components are safe doesn't mean that you won't have a security issue with your company or your users. Let's take a look at a few lessons that we have learned. And these lessons are based on customers that we're working with over several years. And they were all in this phase of trying to tackle their digital transformation and having challenges with really adopting security as part of that transformation. So here we go. One of the lessons we all learned is that, when we work with companies that have success, they have a strong legacy, and they have invested a lot in IT. So they are a perfectly good fish. Okay, so they swim really fast, they have really good tooling, they've run VMware maybe for more than a decade. And even though they still have challenges that they have to overcome in the current environment, it's still looking pretty good. And that's how it's working with technology. There's always something imperfect that you have to fix, right? And what we find is that a lot of these companies, they try to take these processes, these tools, and be a fish on land. So when you take these processes and tools and way of working and culture, and you start to being a fish on land, you will still be able to go on the beach, possibly. It's just that it will be really, really slow, and you won't be really that successful. So you need to transform that. And what we have seen, and our friends, the analysts, have seen, is that unless you have a different culture, you adopt different sets of tools, and maybe you have 100 tools instead of 2 tools for very good reasons. Unless you're doing that and treating transformation as something fundamentally different than you've done for the past 20 years, you're not going to be very successful. You can have some success, but it's going to be very, very slow, and your competition is going to surpass you. So when that is said, still you can move forward, but you're not going to be very very successful. I would say that one of the most important things that we've done with our customers is to set the scene on what they mean by digital transformation. And if you're doing optimization, you're basically reducing costs, you're reducing risk, and you're still staying in that lake. You just try to swim a bit faster. When you're doing a transformation, you are basically trying to enable growth for your company. And as part of that, you need to work differently with security, because you're adding security to an exponentially growing area, which is quite different than adding security to existing layers that you're trying to optimize. And if you're trying to be really innovative, sometimes it means you're trying to disrupt others, which is an even more different part of working with security, where you're trying to do bleeding edge MVPs, and you maybe even trying to disrupt other markets than you are currently in. So setting the scene, it actually helps us to talk about security the right way, so we don't mix the wrong security talks into transformation. One example being that we're just when you work with transformation, part of the process is just turning on the security services and just let them gather the data, and don't come with any security processes, don't come with any organizations or any services on top of that. And it's a very different way of working with security. I would say that one of the most crucial learnings out there, especially when you work with a hyperscaler, this being an example with AWS, it could be GCP, it could be Azure, which is basically the same thing when it comes to this responsibility matrix, is that, whenever you start using something on the internet, whenever you start provisioning these services that are secure by design, once you're doing that, you actually take on a lot of responsibility. You still have to look at the integration. You still have responsibility for the endpoints. You have full responsibility for the code you're writing. You also have all responsibility for the data. It could be also the network traffic in between different availability zones. You definitely also are responsible for the cost, and there's still a lot of different things that you have to think about. And what's happening here is that when developers write the future software, like using microservices, for instance, your software will contain of so many components that adds a lot of complexity to working with security, because there are just so many more interfaces. Even if you're using API gateways and integrating the event handling, you still need to handle that. And I guess from our point of view, what we're trying to do for customers is to really handle that complexity and not hide the complexity necessarily, because having transparency in the complexity, it's actually key to collaboration, but we take on the role to really handle a lot of this complexity so customers can focus on their business model and their business outcomes. Another really important learning that we try to help our customers with is the fact that whenever you start working with a hyperscaler, the threat picture, first of all, it's very, very different. But no matter which hyperscaler you start working with as part of your digital transformation strategy, there are some security threats that are the same actually all over. And it all comes down to how you handle identity and access to these services. Because what happens here is that once you start working with a hyperscaler and you give one person access, and a lot of the time the developer will start and it will pull his credit card and he'll get a user. And all that management of that account, he's doing that on a personal level. And what happens usually when you work with a hyperscaler, rumor spreads and more people want in, and you start innovating really, really fast. You start building really cool new software and features for your end users. And if you're going to handle those accounts and identities manually, you're going to have a big headache because you're going to have to onboard consultants that have very niche knowledge because you don't have all the competencies in one room or even within your company, even though you're a big company. And unless you have a really smooth account and identity management service that can onboard and offboard and really protect this account. So for instance, if a user goes on holiday, he doesn't have access, or it's all in line with your corporate policies, unless you have that in place, you are actually running a pretty big risk. And it's not only about the technical access, but because your credit card info, your payment info is also in here, and you're most likely going to run a lot of mission critical services. It's way more than just uptime and downtime. It goes directly on your money. And since this also has to do with the interfaces of the API gateways that also most likely will integrate with your current systems in a hybrid mode. So you can take APIs from your on-premise environment and you can kind of integrate the public cloud with your private clouds. It can also affect your traditional IT. So this is one of the reasons why we built a cloud foundation, very thin layer that really take this into account, and it solves the vendor management and it solves the basic account and identity management to whoever customer we work with in the public cloud. And here it comes. I'm going to repeat this a lot of times during the webinar. Fit your security to your innovation process. And the fact is that innovation is not a straight line. So it's not like you add a security service in the beginning of your innovation process, and then you add all your security services and processes at the same time, because then you would pretty much be that seed in the water with all those life jackets on. You wouldn't be able to move because you wrapped heavyweight processes around your innovation process, and that's not something that you want to do far to the left. But I'm going to give you some examples on how we can do that. The key point here really is that turning on some security processes without connecting all the services, without connecting all the processes, it's actually a pretty good idea, because what you obtain by that is that once developers have access to data early in the process, they can also start to discuss security as part of functional requirements. And you are making your projects and your software and your services secure by design all the way from the beginning, which is what's happening when you're picking components from a hyperscaler. They do the same thing. They put security into the discussion really, really early, and that's why those components are secure by design. And unless you're doing the same thing, you're still going to be vulnerable in the future, and you might find yourself way less successful than you can be in the market, and also less successful of satisfying your users. One of the successes that many companies have found working with digital transformation is to start making these minimal viable products. And the minimal viable product, it's not a proof of concept, it's not a prototype, it's not a pilot, it's a fully functioning product with its core functions well implemented. So it is functional, it is usable, it is appealing, it's practical, and it's useful. It could be Airbnb in its first form, really. And the beauty here is that when you start working with modern infrastructure, you're working with codified infrastructure, you can actually make these MVPs really, really fast, and you can penetrate the market within weeks or a very short time comparing to a traditional product process. The key point here is that security, it is part of your development. So you're using modern security services and modern security components to fit that to the development process so you can penetrate your market really, really fast. And just to give a quick example, now here you see the development of a car, which may take 18 months, and most likely we'll be adding the security features by the end of this process. The challenge here is that it takes 18 months to roll this car out in the market. And when you work with an MVP, you work with different product lines. So you start making a skateboard and you roll that out to the market. And those wheels here on that skateboard, you know, they have undergone quite a process of ensuring that the wheels won't fall off. Point is, you can reach that market way, way faster than if you wait until the car has developed. So you iterate, you add an electrical engine to that skateboard, and you have a hoverboard. Then you move on to a bike, and you move on to a bicycle, a motorcycle, and so on and so on. So this is a way that companies, when they work with digital transformation, they can satisfy one market group, then a second group, then a third group, and so on, and they will end up with many product lines. Key point here is that security has to be fitted to the innovation process so they can actually penetrate that market with a minimal viable product that is well functional, usable, and appealing to the end customers. When you're working through a transformation, you will most likely be consuming SaaS services, PaaS services, and you even may be consuming traditional EA services for your traditional applications that will be partly lifted and shifted to somewhere else. The key here is that even though a lot of the functional aspect is handled by the vendor that is offering these services, you still actually have to think a lot about security. So even working with SaaS, you still have to protect the endpoints. You still have to think about the security. And when it comes to integration, you have to do account and access management. You have to do identity. You have to take care of your serverless code. And there's still a lot of things that you have to think about when it comes to security. Another challenge is that we tend to put a lot of our security budgets into protecting the perimeter instead of focusing on how you can identify and how you can actually detect and respond and recover from a security incident. Because a lot of the security challenges that we see today, we won't be able to detect them before the damage has done, and that's part of this whole new way of working with security. You shouldn't put all your money on the protect. It's not all about firewalls. A lot of it is actually your ability to be able to respond to a security incident. There are a lot of options when it comes to adding security to your cloud services and as part of your digital transformation. What you should be aware of is that just because the product is being presented through the marketplace or, for instance, AWS or Azure, it doesn't mean that it's really cloud native. And the reason why this is important is that if you implement the wrong tools, you may have some unexpected costs or even unexpected behavior. So you should make sure that the tools that you're picking as part of your DevOps toolkit or as part of the development process actually is fit for purpose when you're working with programmatic infrastructure. If you don't have that competence inside your own company, you could always come to people like ourselves, and we will help you with that. We have also found that one of the most important things to do when you work with, for instance, Azure, is to really turn on the native security tools. They're not on by default, and what you gain by this is that once you let these tools start to gather data, you can actually start discussing these data inside your development teams. So you're sort of building the security culture as part of your development processes a bit under the hood. And I'm not saying that you should connect the security people to connect all the processes yet. It's just turn the tools on so at least have access to the data, and you can build that as part of your development process. And as you can see, what these sorts of tools gives you, it gives you a quick view of the compliance, hygiene factor, and even some concrete recommendations on what you should do in order to higher your security level. And the key point here is really that you should start doing this inside your development team or inside your DevOps culture, because then you don't wait to add security until the last minute before you go production. So these tools, it saves you a lot of hours in order to gather all this data and come up with these recommendations that you should be discussing as part of your development process. And you can even drill down into the compliance status. So for instance, if you are required to be compliant to PCI DSS, you can use these tools to gather all the data to see if you are compliant or if you're about to be breached, and take the necessary measures in order to become compliant again. A lot of these tools will give you very, very specific recommendations on what you have to do to be more secure. And what we are recommending the customers is that, instead of using these tools manually, they should send the output of these tools to a 24/7 SecOps, where we come in, for instance, to help our customers to handle all the output coming from these tools. And the beauty here is that you are saving a lot of money on consultancy hours that is being used traditionally to gather all this data, and you can actually focus on fixing the problems. So this is very, very basic way of engaging your development teams as part of working with security. And if you work with other hyperscalers, such as AWS, you will find similar tools there. One thing is to be aware of, though, is that these security services, they have different pricing models, and you should possibly have a little look on that as part of the process of turning them on. So this is an example used by AWS on how you can actually incorporate vulnerability scan as part of a image creation process. So what the developers have done here, they have incorporated Amazon Inspector, which is an automated security assessment service that will help to improve the security and the compliance of the applications that is here being built on AWS. So this service is being pulled as part of the development process, and then the whole thing is being pushed directly across development, test, and production, and straight into the production environment. And the output by the security services, it could be handled by the 24/7 Cloud Ops or SecOps instead of being sent directly to the developers, which most likely have new applications that they're going to focus on. One of the things that we have found highly effective in order to start building security as part of your innovation process is to actually introduce the security role in your DevOps team. And unless you already have that DevOps culture established, you should start by establishing it and then add the security role into that. Now, what you gain by that is that this DevOps culture, they have the same KPIs and goals. So they share the goals, which basically is about writing better software and services, supporting minimal viral products. That has to be functional, it has to be usable, it has to be secure, and it has to be attractive for the end customers. And when you do this, you naturally start working with security as part of your development process, and you can use this culture to educate the rest of the organization, so the rest of your business units will slowly be moving in the right direction. What this team will be doing, they will also be assessing new tooling, they will establish a lot of automation, and they will be an enabler for you to tackle digital transformation and making minimal viral products that actually are secure by design. One of the key challenges for companies that start to work with hyperscalers is not that they have a lot of cool services, a lot of great functionality. It's the fact that when you put a lot of people to click around in the same web user interface, you're going to have scaling problems and you're going to break things. So one of the first things we do with customers is to introduce infrastructure as code as part of our cloud foundation that also governs the basic security threats that you will find in the public cloud. So the effect that you're getting from this is that you're getting a lot of free security, because now you're treating everything as code. So you can do GitOps, you can reproduce it, you can add governance layers, you can do automation, you have portability of the code, and it's much easier for you to scale development when everyone is using the same set of features to describe and roll out the services. So this is really a key enabler for you to be able to scale your innovation and work with security as part of that scaling process. The last lesson learned for this time is the fact that full transparency is actually a very powerful enabler. Because if you're going to discuss complex challenges and issues across different teams, which you will need to do in order to scale, everyone needs access to the same data. And we're not trying to pulverize responsibility here, but this is a way where you can work with your vendors, you can work with your different business units, they can all see the same data, and you can come in with complementary competences and actually solve security challenges and issues even before they occur. So transparency is key. There's so much more going on today when it comes to data, when it compared to it was 10 years ago, even 3 years ago, and having the capabilities to gather those data and to actually present them with full transparency is going to be a key enabler for you in order to scale your innovation and to add security into your development process. To end this webinar, I put together a few recommendations that can hopefully be of value to you when you're going to go back to your organization and start to work security as part of your innovation process and digital transformation. So the number one is, really put yourself in a situation where you're able to handle the spotlight. And the spotlight is so much more than it was before. It's not just being able to protect your perimeter, it's also your ability to respond to a security incident. So what we see successful companies doing is that they are not only having a communication strategy that is external, they also having an internal communication strategy, because everyone is on social media today. There's a lot of different channels, a lot of different channels into a company, and you need to be able to handle that spotlight. So the second thing is that we still see a lot of companies out there that treat digital transformation as a technology upgrade. So we see a lot of lift and shifts, which can be very financial lucrative for some applications, but really this is not about a technical upgrade, it's about underpinning a new business model. And before you acknowledge that change as an organization, it's going to be really, really hard for you to tackle the security challenges and issues that comes with a new area of business models. So do differ between optimization, transformation, and innovation, because the way you will be working with security is fundamentally different in the 3 different boxes. The third recommendation is to establish a cloud-native delivery model. And it's not only about development, it's also about operations, it's also about security models, and you'll quickly find that you need very different types of tools. You will need a pretty different type of culture within the organization to handle these things, and you even need to staff your existing teams with ecosystems working outside your companies. So work on that cloud-native delivery model, establish the DevOps culture, try to put the security role as part of that, and you will most likely be more successful than if you didn't. Also segment your security strategy, not only to handle the traditional infrastructure as a service. You also need to look at serverless. You need to see how do you handle IAM tags on the serverless codes, whose responsibility is it? Are you incubating that in the DevOps team? Are you putting it to your operations team? Or where do you handle these security strategies? And it's not only going to be hyperscalers or private clouds. what the statistics says, that companies are doing all the 6 R's. So they're not only lifting and shifting, they're also building from scratch. Some they are improving before they're moving, and so on and so on. And your security strategy needs to handle all of these different ways of working with services. It's not only going to be happening inside of our data centers. There's a big push on edge computing and IoT and what it can do for us, not only as companies, but also for society. So put yourself in a situation where you can also handle the concentration of these devices that actually gather data. It's not only happening inside the data center or inside the hyperscalers. It's going to be happening at the edge. And it's very different working with security when it comes to a sensor or light bulb than it is from working security on a PaaS service that runs inside a data center, which security components are secure by design. And lucky for many of us, trust still seems to beat price. So the trust part is still very important when it comes to consumers. However, what we do see is that it's so much easier to ruin the trust these days than it was before. And think about like 6-7 years ago, you didn't even have a social media manager. So being able to handle that types of threats that comes from protecting your brand, for instance, it's going to be a pretty important part for you in the future. And it's basically about the trust that you have with your customer base. I think I'll end this webinar with a very old word of wisdom, which says something like, it doesn't help being right when it ends up being wrong. The key point here is really that if you are going to tackle your digital transformation, you cannot work in silos because you're underpinning your future business model, and you need to bring in competencies and talents across your whole organization, work in a cross-functional team in order to establish the culture to succeed with this transformation. And if you don't have all these competencies inside the organizations, there are a lot of ecosystems out there that is willing to help you to staff those roles, and we are one of them. So if you're looking for help on tackling your digital transformation, please reach out to us after the webinar. And if you have any questions, you can place those in the Q&A section after the webinar. Thank you for listening in.